Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special episode tonight on Independence Live as part of our extensive COP coverage. Now, what we're going to do over the next hour is talk about how the press have been covering COP, but we're also going to look at how they covered it in the run-up to the event and also in general how they cover the climate crisis. Now, I'm William Thomson. I'm just thinking what my job title is at the moment. I think it's Content Executive at Independence Live, but I'm joined by three wonderful journalists to help us talk through the coverage of COP. First we have Abbi. Hello, Abbi. How are you doing?
Hello, good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. From the National. And then we have Mike from Caledonia.
Hi.
Hello. And we have Fiona from the Orkney News.
Hello.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. I thought to get going, I'd just say to you, what's kind of been your general thoughts on the coverage of COP so far? I'm going to start with you, Abbi, because I know you were there on the first day, but I know you haven't been there for the last couple of days. So what's been your general thoughts? And then we'll get into some of the detail about some of the things that you've picked out.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of those things where there's been a lot more coverage of things that are going on outside of COP than the kind of actual policy that's going on. I've seen loads more news reports about Leonardo DiCaprio being in Mary Hill than the kind of actual substance of what's going on, which I can get into a little bit later on as we talk about it. But that's kind of one of the main things I would say from what I've noticed is that there seems to be a lot of tension on like protests and how that's affecting people more than the actual what are the people at COP doing to fix this massive issue about the climate crisis. And if they are, it's all been kind of shown through a lens of what we're being told in COP and not really hearing from a lot of other voices, like Indigenous people and people from the global south who are more impacted by this. It's more coming from the high heads of state and all the focus on, Biden was here and the motorcades going past and stuff like that. So that's my hot take from the beginning.
Yeah, that focus on this side show. And Mike, what's been your thoughts so far?
Yeah, I think it is kind of like a bit of a mirror on the world in terms of the motorcades, the cavalcades, the limousines, and the sort of celebrities, and then all the people, as you say, that are excluded either because they can't afford to be in Glasgow or they can't afford to get there. As you say, the Indigenous people and people from the global south. So the immediate impression is of that complete divide about presenting the world with an elite that not only doesn't seem to have any leadership, but also is a sort of spectacle of massive hypocrisy. And the other thing I think that's interesting in Scottish terms is watching how the UK and Scotland play this out in terms of how they want to present themselves to the world. And we can maybe talk a bit more about that in a bit.
Great, yeah, there's definitely been some differences there. Fiona, what about you? What have your thoughts been of the coverage of the last few days and COP in general?
Well, I've actually been watching it on the UN channel, which is their feed, because you get it direct from them. And today was Energy Day. So that's all been quite interesting because not only have you got the so-called leaders of the world, you've got scientists and things speaking as well. So it gives you a different perspective than just the gossipy type of stuff. The media has an incredible responsibility to report accurately, and what they tend to concentrate on is maybe not what is actually happening at the actual COP meetings.
Yeah, that seems to be like a general consensus across the three of you there in terms of what actually is making the news. I wondered before we go into some of those examples, I wonder what you thought of Glasgow and how the media have been covering Glasgow as the host city and Glaswegians, and also kind of Scotland as the country for COP. Any thoughts on how the average Glaswegian's looking in this? Abbi, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of focus on rubbish, which is quite, I guess, a topical thing at the moment with the worker strikes and things going on. But as you probably saw today, that a lot of the protesters joined the GMB strike to kind of, give their support to that. So I don't know, I think Glasgow probably much to the upset of the mainstream media, is probably going to come across quite well. And that's because, despite all the fact that we've been chucked on it, I live in Glasgow. It's hard to get around now. It is like a ring of steel around COP at the moment, and there's road closures and stuff. And I was there when they had the VIP party, and I had to walk right down the bottom of the road and go right to Byers Road, and it was miles long, and women were being left to walk in the dark. So I would say that probably the authorities are going to come off worse more than this than the people of Glasgow, to be honest. I think that they're handling it as well as what they can, because it's been put on them, this COP26, and all the things they're having to deal with.
Yeah, that's very good points there. And Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some really funny kind of othering of Scotland. There was that hilarious take of American UN delegates sampling Scottish food. So they had Cullen skink and square sausage and stuff. And that's a bit weird. I mean, some of that becomes like sort of really patronising coverage. Some of it's funny, but some of it is really weird and othering. In terms of Glasgow, I think what we'll see increasingly is the police move in on protesters, and we're already getting reports of that, of stop and search and heavy-handed policing, because this comes in the context of the Tory government's effective criminalisation of peaceful protest in the last year in various pieces of legislation. So I think that's something to watch in terms of how this pans out on the streets. But I also think that there's been some incredibly innovative and interesting protest developments. It's not just a sort of set piece of performative activism. There's things like the Govern Free State, which are really interesting kind of acts of symbolic game changing that are going on. So you've got a few things going on. You've got the surveillance state kicking in, and you've also got activists acting in quite different ways, which is very worth exploring.
Yeah, again, those are a couple of stories that are outside of the conference hall again. Fiona, how do you think Glasgow and Scotland's been portrayed with the coverage?
Well, I've actually only been to Glasgow about 6 times in my entire life, but I think it's a fabulous city, for goodness sake. And we've actually at the Orkney News been in a collaboration with Govan Hill Community Magazine, and they've produced a magazine for COP26 that's at the fringe events, and it's drawn on community publications all across Scotland and their views on climate change. So I think it's marvellous. Glasgow's a great and deservedly proud city, and quite right that is in the world focus at the moment.
Great. Well, certainly, as a Glaswegian who doesn't live there anymore, but in the events industry, I was really surprised that Glasgow won COP, because I never thought it was big enough. And never thought that Glasgow had the infrastructure. I went to the last COP, which was in Madrid, and Madrid had the infrastructure, and I'm looking at Glasgow now, and Glasgow the infrastructure looks to be like it's creaking, and I think it's really struggling with the numbers and the amount of events. So yeah, I was quite surprised that it had it, but I do think it's come across quite well. Abbi, would you like to bring up our first example that you've picked out for us, and we can have a chat about that?
Yes, if you'd like to bring up the Camilla's buttons thing I sent you, I would be very happy.
Yes, this was actually... Mike picked this up as well. So, Mike, you'll probably laugh when you see this one.
Yeah, so this is a reporter from the Daily Mail, and it was a video of Camilla walking into the VVIP party that they had at Kelvin Grove, just going on about how she had featuring buttons recycled from another outfit, which, let's be honest, people have been doing that for years. My nana used to do it when I was a child. So it's just the way that they frame it, as if the royals are doing something, look, she's changed her buttons. It's revolutionary. It really angered me, this tweet, if you couldn't tell. And also, when I was looking into it, there was actually an article from the Daily Mail as well, which was going on about Kate wearing shoes 12 times. So when they're talking about these sorts of things, it's not based in reality. That doesn't matter to people who are actually trying to make a difference to climate change. If one of the royals wore shoes 12 pairs of times, makes no sense to me. So those kind of stories, that's the kind of thing that we're getting at the moment, where they're focusing on the celebrities and silly things about the environment that they're actually not making a difference. And the Queen was on the front page of the papers the next day after that. She wasn't even there. It was a video address. And she's been lobbying the Scottish Government to get out of climate change regulations.
I'd definitely
So,
like to come back.
it's ridiculous.
I'd like to come back to the Queen and the Royals a little bit more in depth. But Mike, as you picked out that tweet as well, what made you forward that one?
Well, like Abby, I suppose it's just the ridiculousness of it, and it's very much a kind of British lens and the spin of the UK media. So this is about the Queen and Camilla and Prince Philip and Prince Charles. And I think what happens in that is that we get presented, Britain gets presented, and Scotland as part of Britain gets presented through the kind of lens of three white, very upper class men. You know, it's like Prince Charles, Boris Johnson, and David Attenborough. And I know David Attenborough is a great environmentalist, but it is an incredible presentation to the world of what Britain is. And that tweet about the recycling of buttons is just, I suppose it's part of the absurdity of this presentation, because it's about this idea that micro changes are going to make a difference. And it's really kind of obscene given the situation that we're in.
On to the other example that Abby chose. I think this was your one, Abby. This was the other thing. Yeah, this was the other thing about the Queen making the making all of the front pages. So again, if you want to talk through that, and then Fiona, I'll come to you with your views of the royals and how we're being perceived in the globe by these three, older white males as well. Abby, so we've got this one about the Queen.
Yeah, so I was looking through the front page papers, and it was all about the Queen saying that, we have to look after the fragile planet. And it's just another show of hypocrisy kind of from the royal family and the UK government, because she was lobbying the Scottish government to get out of using climate legislation in Balmoral. I mean, that came out from The Guardian a couple of months ago, and it was just shocking. And the fact that they then continually just put the Queen and act as if, she's pushing everyone to do all these things for climate change, when in reality she's not doing them herself, and the family aren't doing them themselves, and they've got a higher carbon footprint because of all the flights that they take and all the things that they do as part of their jobs as royals, that they're not, from what I can see, they're not making any big efforts to change that, but putting it on, people, the public to do it instead.
Apart from the buttons,
and the shoes, of course. You've got to wear our shoes more than once.
Mike, what's your thoughts a little bit wider, pushing away from those couple of tweets, but the royals as representing the UK, and also the thing that Abby touched on there, which is this kind of blatant hypocrisy in terms of the environmental impact.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't really expect a kind of feudal aristocracy to be leading the change that we require to transform the world. But I do think it's interesting, the framing of the press. So this week we saw quite a lot of the Queen's personal testimony was on the front page of a number of papers, saying that this was an impassioned plea. And this was based on two things. One, her son Charles being this great environmentalist, which is obviously nonsense. And two, in memory of Prince Philip. Now, there's been an attempt to kind of resurrect Prince Philip as a great environmentalist ever since he died. Now, this was a man who was known in popular culture for his racism throughout his entire life, and is known to have shot tigers. I mean, the kind of the level of hagiography and revisionism that's engaged here to try and use COP as a platform for resurrecting Prince Philip's career is off the scale. It's hilarious, and I think this is just parody Britain. It's the state that we're tied to, and when you get a kind of global lens on it, it becomes quite shameful and embarrassing.
Fiona, are you going to jump up and stand up for the royals?
Oh, that'd be the first for a game. This is the kind of stuff that massively depresses me, and it's news for the home market, right? And it's also why I watch the UN feed rather than read what's in any of the UK papers or whatever they're tweeting online, because it's completely irrelevant to the climate emergency we're in now. And my standout speech at the moment from the UN COP has been by the Prime Minister of Barbados. And she's been absolutely fabulous. And she's basically summed up the issue for 2/3 of the world, and the catastrophe that we're facing if we don't do something about it now, not next week, but now. And so that's how crucial COP26 is. And I really don't care about recycle buttons.
Great. Well, I'm not going to stand up for the royals either, but I do think that the hypocrisy there is just incredible, and the amount of billionaires who have been on the stage talking to the audience, or people who are in charge of hedge funds with billions of pounds, has just been absolutely shocking. But I certainly think that the media, as always, has given the royal family just such a free ride at COP. And, apart from your article, Abby, I didn't see anything else that called out the blatant hypocrisy of having the royals there. It's not that they haven't done anything. I think the issue is that they can do so much, especially the Queen, with the amount of land that she holds in Scotland and the rest of the country. So absolutely no one calling that out. I'm going to call, Abby, I'm just going to go to your next one, which is your hypocrisy, and maybe you could highlight some of the other areas of hypocrisy that you saw there.
Yeah, I think one that kind of just came to me there as we were discussing is Jeff Bezos actually even being at COP26. It's massively just hypocrisy, because we've had a billionaire space race going on this year during the middle of a climate crisis. And there's going to be a report coming out tomorrow, actually, which will be on the National, which is kind of along these lines. So I can't talk about all of it because it's embargoed, but just kind of talking about it generally, going into space takes a lot of carbon to get up there, and that is going to give them a higher footprint than anybody else. And the fact that he was standing on the stage talking about how he was in space all wistfully was just ridiculous. And then the way it was actually reported was Jeff Bezos has given £2 billion to help the climate crisis. Jeff Bezos could literally solve the climate crisis if he just handed over the cash. £2 million is nothing to him. So that's another kind of big side of hypocrisy. So not only do they have billionaires and kind of people from the oil and gas industry at COP, it's all being kind of put through this frame of, they're donating £2 billion. That's going to do nothing. I think it's about 100 trillion that we need all in all to actually combat the climate crisis, if you put it in those kind of terms. So that's kind of one of the things that always screams to me, is the way that it's framed. These really rich people are giving away 2 billion, which sounds a lot if you're on, a normal income, but for them, nothing, So that's another example. I'm very angry about Jeff Bezos.
Fiona, was there any hypocrisy that you picked up over the coverage, and also, not just the coverage, but at the conference?
Well, the fact that hundreds of private jets have been used to get there, I mean, what is that even about? I mean, that's the hypocrisy of people not willing to change their behaviour or whatever they want to do to actually address climate change. So they'll stand up and make all the right noises, but when it comes down to what can I do personally, they're not willing to make their own change. So that's been appalling. I think also the Indigenous peoples who are at the front line of climate change, who are seeing the real changes to their daily lives and the extinction of some of their cultures. I mean, their voices need amplified, and I would have liked to have seen the media given more attention to their voices.
Great, yeah, I think we would all agree with that. Mike, I think you've just muted yourself there. Where's the hypocrisy that you've seen, if you have seen any?
Well, it's kind of baked in. I'd just like to flag up that we've got a kind of takeover for the next 2 weeks of Bella, of people from the Global South and Indigenous people. So if you follow that, you can see that daily. We'll have 12 different people from the Global South. And this evening we published a special piece from Indigenous people who were in Glasgow and hearing their voice. So I suppose, when we're talking about the media, it's worth breaking it down, because there is good alternative media out there that are doing this, and I'm not just flying my own flag. I'm thinking of the Ferret's done some exceptionally good work, as has Open Democracy, and there's a number of outlets that are doing really interesting work that's changing the narrative, because a lot of this is about framing, how you frame the problem, how you understand the problem, and I think reframing this as a systemic problem that needs deep transformational change is the key. And most of the media either operates on a sort of level of celebrity, whether that's the Queen or, Bezos, or it takes you into the realm of sort of the micro lifestyle lens, where it's all about, whether you rinse your dishes or not, which is what Allegra Stratton, the Number 10 spokesman, had been encouraging people to do. So that's about framing the problem. Rather than saying this is a systemic problem of the economic system, it's saying it's your problem about how you rinse your dishes. And so I think that's the wider, deeper problem of the media narrative.
And that's been consistent when it comes to the environment since the 50s and since the 1960s, isn't it? It's putting it on you, and it's saying that small changes can make a difference. Is there anyone who, within the mainstream media or the alternative media, that any of you have seen that is telling these stories and telling them well? And any thoughts on that? There you go. Well, there's an answer, Mike.
There was a BBC correspondent who, I can't remember his name. He took on Boris Johnson in an interview last night, I think, about the issue of a new coal field, and that was quite interesting because it seems so rare on the BBC. And Johnson was kind of like slightly stunned and had to backpedal and say, "Well, it's not I don't really make these decisions, But that was good. I think there are individual journalists out there doing a good job. I think there are lots of alternative media doing a good job. I don't think it's all bad. I think it's the red tops and the mainstream public broadcasters that are really really dire.
Yeah, I suppose we can't expect the media to look at climate any differently than it does anything else. And that seems to be exactly the same. It is through that frame of certainly celebrity is the way to go. Fiona, any thoughts on anyone who you've seen who's done anything that you think's a little bit more truthful?
I did notice Bella was running their series on the Indigenous voices. I did notice that, and I thank them for doing that. CNN have been quite good. They've covered quite a few interviews with people that maybe the Daily Mail don't go near. But unfortunately, that's not getting to the mass of the British population. And what we're seeing with the coverage of COP26 is exactly what we've seen with the coverage of COVID. I mean, these two things are inextricably linked. And it's no surprise that our COVID rates are escalating again appallingly. And it's because that reporting in mainstream media has been so poor on both these issues.
Yeah, that's a really good point, linking that to COVID. Okay, we've got a couple of comments from the audience. Amina has said, I think Channel 4 News has been covering COP quite well. It normally covers things a lot better than most of the other mainstream media, so that's interesting that you would say that. Susan has said Rupert Reed and George, I can never pronounce his second name, Monibot. Monbiot, that's it. And yeah, he is an absolute climate warrior, and I think he's been hosting a channel actually over COP. So I know he's been doing some stuff. Susan was on the march today, and she said I was at the Peace March today, which passed through Govan to BAE Systems. I think that was. The poverty there contrasted with the royals and bigwigs and private jets. A just transition needs to be addressed and needs to address poverty everywhere. And again, I'd be interested to see if any of you have seen anything in the coverage that kind of links what's happening in Glasgow to the need for infrastructure and expenditure in the poorer places in Scotland and the UK and across the globe, or is this just way over the horizon for the media? Any thoughts on that?
I have a little. Well, if you think about that, all the delegates are getting the free travel card to go around Glasgow. That's something that pretty much Glasgows have been asking for a long time, and I don't think that it can be ignored now that it can be done. So I think that could possibly push us towards a little bit of a change in infrastructure, because it is expensive getting around Glasgow if you live in two different ends of the city. If I want to go and see my friend in Scotland, I've got to get two different buses, which thankfully, it's one ticket. But if I was going somewhere suburban, we need something else. So, and that does affect people's daily lives, more so now that we're starting to come out of the pandemic and people are going to have to go back to work. So you've just got to hope that kind of does kind of come through a little bit, that would help people in Glasgow and would help generally probably across Scotland if we had just a look at the transport system and how it's funded and how much it costs, because it is expensive. Really.
Yeah. Mike, Fiona, any thoughts on the coverage a little bit wider than just what's happening around the conference or within the conference in terms of kind of poverty reduction and infrastructure investment, things like that?
There was a programme on ITV, and it was about Orkney, Britain's Green Isles, and it was all looking at our renewables, which is all true. But it was a kind of Disneyland-esque romantic view of Orkney, where we all looked at puffins and everybody did awfully well out of the wind turbines. Well, there are one or two community, well, there's more than one or two, but there's several community wind turbines. But over half the population in Orkney live in fuel poverty, including myself. So this is the kind of nonsense that goes up on the TV, presenting like Orkney as if it's got this renewables paradise. And whilst there was nothing incorrect in that programme, it was only one side of the story, and it didn't give the aspect that for many people and young families and everything, they've got to choose between heating and eating this winter. And that's a shocking state where we produce 120% of our energy by renewables. I mean, that's a madness.
Yeah, I think that the idea that the West is ready to give this huge amount of money to the global South to cure poverty and hunger, when there's so many people in the Western democracies who are struggling and who have to choose between heating and eating is incredible just to think that. Mike, we've got a couple of examples that you've sent across. Will we look at the first one, which was the BBC's take on I think it was flights in and out of Prestwick?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really loving the BBC Scotland News coverage. I've been a big fan of its environmental coverage for years. But here, their take on it is that COP, rather than be a kind of historic existential moment, rather than that, their take on it is that you can see some really interesting cargo planes coming through Prestwick. And you sort of think, oh man, what's the meeting where somebody comes up with that as the line, and the editor says, yeah, let's go with that. That's a really great take on COP. So this is the kind of just delirious absurdism that is an aspect of media coverage of climate. It's just kind of we don't really know what to do about this. We don't really know what to say. So we'll just fling anything at it. And, who cares, because we don't really know what's going on.
Yeah, we have to say something. We have to fill the Twitter feed and the and the news items with something. So they seem to be really struggling. Well, certainly what I've noticed is that the climate crisis is so all pervasive now, but it's really complicated. And, and if you just start talking, I don't know, you could talk about renewables, or you could talk about hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen. You can talk about sustainable development. And there's just this huge amount that's under this surface of climate change. And I don't think that many, if any, of the correspondents have had the time or the inclination to look into this, and you can see it's so superficial when they're meeting with people, and that's a huge issue, that the people who are in front of us know nothing about this, and they're still having this idea of saying to people, well, are we able to believe the scientists? Can you tell me when things are going to, when are the ice caps going to dissolve? These types of things are really incredible, and we're not seeing anyone who's got that level of detail, who's able to properly investigate these issues. Fiona, Abbi, any comments on kind of BBC Scotland's coverage and maybe thinking about that view of look to the skies to see all the planes?
I mean, I haven't been watching it, but I did laugh when I saw that tweet come up because I couldn't quite believe it. It doesn't seem quite far off of what BBC Scotland do. I mean, I've seen a few, this is prior to COP, but I have seen a few articles from their BBC coverage about Camp oil field, and they've done it from the side of the developer and had nothing about the actual environmental impacts. So I can completely believe that story, because that is the kind of way that they do things. They'll go on it and they don't actually explain the environmental side of it. And I made a very conscious decision, knowing that COP was coming up, to kind of try and orientate myself with this stuff as much as possible, so that I could explain it in my articles. And it just doesn't, as from seeing that BBC one there, it's clear that not everybody did that.
well, we've got that. We've actually got that tweet because Mike sent that one as well. Fiona, any thoughts on? I know you said you haven't really been watching or engaging with BBC Scotland, but I wonder if you've got any thoughts about that.
Well, we do actually see climate change right outside the door here, because we've got coastal erosion, we've got rise in sea levels, our seabird population has been decimated. You can see it for yourself, but there's still thousands of Arcadians who don't believe that the climate is changing. What is that about? And that is where the media has a responsibility to inform. And, the COVID pandemic is part of our loss of biodiversity, a result of climate change. So you're going to have more pandemics. So if you don't think you can see climate change, or you think it's too complicated, just look at the COVID figures and just look at the way our economy's been decimated by that. Now, there you are. That's what's happening here. And now think, what about other parts of the world where they've got even more immediate challenges with rising sea levels, extreme weather events? Remember all the fires last year, the wildfires? That's all part of it.
Great. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of commentators get mixed up between the weather and the climate. And that's what you see happening quite a lot. And I know, Mike, you've picked it up in a couple of tweets over the summer with this. Wow, let's look ahead to the most amazing summer, everyone. And there is still this complete denial that we're in a situation because of how much carbon we've put into the atmosphere since the 60s. It just seems to be completely missing. We're going to go back to oil, Abbi, because that is a really important area to cover. Mike, I'm going to bring up the tweet that you sent along, which was this one.
Yeah, this is BBC Scotland News again. It's suffering from false equivalency, which is actually, it's got its own guidelines about this that it consistently breaches. So it's sort of saying here, well, North Sea oil could be great. What are we going to do? And then it quotes the International Energy Association saying you just can't have any more oil. And then it sort of says, but look, here's somebody from the oil industry who says maybe we should. And it constantly does this. It sort of frames these as just like, this is impartiality, is giving every side of the story, even though that's kind of insane. You don't go, well, we're going to talk to the doctor and then we're going to talk to the tobacco industry. You don't do that anymore. And we're way past this. One of the problems for BBC Scotland in particular is that their environment correspondent, Kevin Keane, who probably wrote this, although it's unauthored, it's not named piece, is also their industry correspondent. So sometimes he'll publish pieces which are essentially just a press release that he's been sent by Shell, which they'll stick that picture of an oil rig on. And then a couple of days later, he'll kind of do some patsy environment piece. But he's genuinely the environment correspondent and the industry correspondent. And this is extraordinary given where we are, and that's our public broadcaster in Scotland. This is a disgraceful situation. And when they get called out on it, they get very, very defensive. But I've seen press releases that I've received, and then I've looked at their website. It's like, oh, that's really quite like the press release that I got sent 2 hours ago. This just isn't good enough, and it's extraordinary given the funding that even BBC Scotland has, that they have one environment correspondent and he's kind of on a split shift and he doesn't really know what he's talking about.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Fiona, Abbi? I saw
Yeah,
you nodding
that-
away,
that-
Abbi. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It's just one of those things where actually it totally reminded me. I was watching a press conference with Alex Sharma this morning, and I can't remember where the guy was from, but he stood up and asked why Shell weren't invited to COP and why these people weren't being involved in the conversation. It's like, because they're causing the problems. And it seems to be this disconnect between the press and the fact that oil and gas is actually causing a lot of these issues, and we really need to stop it. I mean, all the headlines were saying Code Red for Humanity mere months ago, and now they're asking why Shell isn't at the conference about saving the planet. It's crazy. I don't think that people quite understand what is happening there. So yeah, that's my thought on it.
I noticed that BBC in general tends to cover anything about the oil industry. The economics correspondent tends to cover the oil industry, even when it's talking about the impacts in the climate crisis. And I'm reading these articles and thinking, you don't really know what the impact of fossil fuels is, and you've got a perspective that's about the economy, and that's the problem. And I think that's the main problem that we've had for the last 30 years is we're still looking at climate change as this kind of, what will it cost, how much money will it cost, can we afford it? And economists who've been designing these models to show how expensive they are never tend to look at the benefits, and also put in things in like renewables never coming down in price, so they're always going to have a really expensive option for renewables. So there's a huge issue with who it is that's covering the issues of the climate crisis for sure. We've got I think we've got one more from you, Abbi, which I think is probably the most important one that you sent me, and I've just got the image, and I don't think we need to explain it, but it'd be good for you just to talk through why you chose this.
My screen has cut off. Oh yes, Vanessa. So this was a story. So actually, I'm quite proud of this because the National were the only people that actually named Vanessa Nakati, who is the black girl in the picture. But every other newspaper didn't. It was all Nicola Sturgeon meets Greta Thunberg, and some of them actually cut her out of the picture. And she is an African, activist about the environment. She knows what she's talking about. She's got a lot of good ideas that she should be listened to. And they're just erasing her. And there's no other reason than the fact that she's a young black woman. I mean, I would like to find another reason, to be honest, for why they did that. But I can tell you that's probably why. And that was actually quite shocking. I thought that when I saw it, I think I'd sent you the thread. And it was everyone. They'd actually either cut her out or she was in the picture and not named. And that's just shocking. And you think we would be beyond that because it happened before, not even that was a year or so ago.
I think for a lot of people that'll sum up COP. I think that image that you've got there. Fiona, any thoughts on that, particularly, that image?
Well, yeah, I know that one, and they like to slag off Greta Thunberg as well. I mean, the abuse that lassie gets is appalling. And I mean, we should be praising all these young people that are looking ahead and trying to sort out the mess we've all created.
Mike, any thoughts on that image that Abbi sent us?
I'd actually missed that, so thank you, Abbi. But and good for you guys on covering it. And I do remember that had happened a few months ago. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary, and I think it just speaks to the issue that these issues are interlinked, and you won't get environmental justice until you have racial justice, and you won't get environmental justice until you have social justice. And so these things need to be brought out into the open. So well done on the National. Great.
We've got a couple of questions from the audience. Ariel asks, How do you maintain your mental health sanity by consuming and engaging with mainstream British media? I assume that's rhetorical, but if any of you want to kind of jump into that one. The next question is that the BBC is full of lazy journalism. Where is the investigative and fact checking? Would either of you like to comment on that? Is the BBC lazy and not checking facts, or is that an unfair call? Fiona, do you want to have a stab at that one first?
Well, I don't watch the BBC. I don't have a license, so I don't support them in any way. So that would be my answer to folk. Don't pay your license. Don't watch it. Go to the live feed from the UN, or read Bella or the National or the Orkney News and get some proper news.
Well, there you go. I don't know if either of you can top that, but do you want to have a stab, Abby?
Well, I don't watch either, not being honest, but I do have a TV license, but I don't watch it. But I would say, having worked for unionist media before, that a lot of that comes from top down, and a lot of the reporters will probably be doing their job, and then it gets turned around when it gets to somebody else gets their hands on it. That's another thing that you kind of got to keep in mind. They probably are checking their facts, but it just decides what facts that they're choosing to use as well. That's another point I would make.
And Mike?
I think there's good journalists within the BBC surviving. I think it's about the wider societal framing that the BBC reflects, which is all this nonsense either about celebrity takes or kind of slightly forelock tugging coverage of the royals, or what George Monbiot called micro lifestyle bollocks. Which the BBC's websites are absolutely full of this advice about how to do a low carbon fry up, or how to do your makeup low carbon, or all this kind of stuff, which is just, it's extraordinary coverage.
I must say, I watched a little bit of Sky News yesterday, and I thought their coverage was really quite in depth. And they had a correspondent in the Maldives speaking about the coastal erosion and the impact of rising sea levels. They also had a correspondent, I think, in India talking about the difficulty coming off coal. And I just thought, this is really good. But this is what the news should be like every day and every week, not just during COP. And I know as soon as this is finished, there'll just be a big kind of like screen wipe, and we'll be on to something else. And I think that it's shown us how in-depth the media can be if it really wants to. And I hope that there's enough pressure to say to people, these issues haven't gone away just because the conference has left Scotland. We need to keep covering these to the level that you have. And I think we can do that if we're demanding much more of our media. Any thoughts on that? Abby, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, sorry, I've lost my train of thought there for a wee second. Somebody else wants to pick that up. Sorry.
Mike?
Sorry.
Well, I think it's true. It's something about the kind of transience and superficiality of the media. Like, it's black friends of mine have said, when it's Black History Month, everybody comes to them and says, Can you do something for us? We need this media moment. And it's certainly like wall-to-wall coverage about the environment just now. But so much of it is so bad and so superficial. It's not really got a lot of value to it. So I think that is an interesting question about how do you build in this conversation and this issue to our general public conversation? Because this is the existential crisis of our time, not just of our generation, but of our species. So it shouldn't just be like one of the topics on the drop-down menu. Now we're going to speak about the environment. This is it. So if next month I was thinking about this today as I was listening to extensive coverage about the John Lewis advert today, which has just passed me by as a sort of phenomenon. But the media talks about the John Lewis advert every year now for a very long time. I'm like, what is this about? What's going on? So I don't know how you disengage from that kind of moron media.
Fiona, any thoughts on how we keep even if it's a kind of superficial environmental climate narrative in the mainstream media, how do we keep that going? What can we do to kind of persuade the news organisations that this isn't a story, but it's this story for for this foreseeable future?
Well, I just know that at the Orkney News, it's certainly not superficial. We cover environmental and climate issues daily. You'll see it in all our articles, the interconnectedness of things, um, as Douglas Adams would say. Um, and, we're just tiny, we're just wee, but there are mainstream journalists that follow what we do, and the hope is always there that maybe they'll pick out something in what we're saying and use it and run with it and give it a bigger audience or whatever. But it's certainly not an, an issue for just 2 weeks for the Orkney News. It's actually the reason why we're a publication. We set up to report honestly, and part of that was on the environment.
Brilliant. Well, I would encourage everyone who's watching to definitely check out Bella, Orkney News, and also the National. Abby, specifically thinking about the National, do you think the National's coverage of climate is going to change from here? Because I'm sure you would agree it's not like the raison d'etre for the publication, but do you think we'll start seeing much more,
Yes.
many more climate stories in the National?
Yes, hopefully, because that's something that I personally am trying to kind of take a lead on at the moment. Ever since I started 6 months ago, they've let me kind of go on and focus on a lot of environmental things because when I started, said that I think that is a big thing that we're missing and that it needs to be kind of brought in to the things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis and make sure that we're explaining it to people, because when you read it, I mean, it's like Brexit. The mainstream press doesn't cover Brexit and we do. And I was like, and the same thing as with climate, we should be doing it like that. And we should, making sure that people are understanding what's going on in our country when it comes to climate. So yeah, it is something that we are definitely working to putting out more and to working on. And personally, something that I'm definitely going to keep working on in that way too.
Fantastic. And Mike, I know it's always been a main part of you as a person and also Bella as a publication. I take it it's going to continue.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, I think that my other work focuses on degrowth and decolonisation as kind of key parts of the climate movement. But I think it is a fault line for the independence movement, because for a number of years there were people talking about a oil field west of Shetland that was secret, and this turned out to be Campbell. And of course, the Unionists ridiculed nationalists for saying this. But then when we discover this oil field, what we also discover is that what we need to do is not exploit it. So the narrative has shifted within the independence movement from it's Scotland's oil to actually it's Scotland's wind or it's Scotland's tidal, and we need to move forward. And I think that for younger people in the independence movement, the idea of exploiting Campbell is such an anathema that it's just not really credible. So we need to have, I think, a much more forward-looking, future-focused independence movement that really moves way beyond fossil fuels.
Yeah, I know Phantom Power had a tweet which I was trying to grab but I didn't have time, which was basically putting an article from 2014 saying something along the lines of not much oil left in Scotland oils field, and then a tweet today which says considerable amount in Scotland's oil fields, and I agree completely. That's kind of irrelevant because we can't be pulling that out anyway, but that was quite interesting. I wanted to mention one of our favourites on the channel is Sir Ian Wood, and his still kind of profile within the media. Now, I know this happens in some other areas. Certainly the professor from Aberdeen University who has always been called up for COVID. I can't really remember his name to see if you get it, but Ian Wood is always brought on to speak about not the oil industry but climate. Is this something that you see, these kind of just incongruous people who are commenting on areas when it comes to the environment? Fiona, have you noticed anything like that?
Well, it's why I read research papers by actual scientists that are dealing in the environment and biodiversity, and we've got loads of fabulous experts and fantastic research going on, not just in institutions in this country, but across the world. And so there's plenty of experts they could go to. So it's obviously just that they reach for the guy they've got on speed dial instead of, let's get some people that are actually knowledgeable about this subject.
And it certainly tends to be a guy, doesn't it? Abby, any thoughts on that? Because you're at a newspaper. It must happen to you when you're like, who do I go to for a quote on this? Do you think is this just lazy journalism, and do you see this kind of bizarre perspective from people who are in other parts of the media?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I think they just go to whoever will answer the phone, to be honest. I mean, as a journalist who's been up against deadlines before, but I do try and make a conscious effort to find somebody who knows what they're speaking about. Can't quite, comment on how other journalists do their work. But I think it's one of those things where you need to make a conscious effort. I basically did my dissertation on this actually when you said, it's always a man. And I had done my dissertation on how, the gender breakup of experts that were used. And it's whenever you do a gender breakdown, it's always 70% male to 30% women, roundabouts. And that was pretty much what I found. So I've made a conscious effort as a journalist to try and get as many women as I can to speak about these things, as well as trying to find different voices. But from being in the media since I did my dissertation, it's probably still about 70-30 gender breakdown, and it's probably still the same white men talking about it as well. So yeah, I do think that journalists do need to think about who they are using in these stories and, what the context of what they're saying is too.
Mike, any background to why we see the same faces time and time again, sometimes talking about things that they've not really got much knowledge or experience in?
Well, there is. I was laughing as Abby was talking because there is that study of how men will, if invited, will give a opinion on a subject they know absolutely nothing about, and women, even if they're experts on that subject, are reluctant to. I know that for BBC Scotland, for example, there's contracts with specific companies that present the same people. So that's why when it's Shireen Nanjani or some morning show, you'll hear the same old voices over and over again because they've got a contract with that company who provides them. And they're often not very interesting, not very, well researched or thought, but it's just a contract. So it's not even just laziness, it's just kind of like built into their system. And I don't really think, is this okay? Should we be doing this? Is anybody interested? They just kind of trundle on. So yeah, that's not very good.
No, it's not. Well, it is about diversity and having different people's perspectives for sure. And it's been great to have the three of you on here tonight, giving us a different perspective of the media that we would really get anywhere else. My final question tonight was just around how we feel that Scotland and the Scottish approach to the environment has been portrayed, and how Westminster's approach to the environment has been portrayed. Do you think that people who were following the mainstream media in the UK have got a clear idea that Scotland has got a slightly more greener approach? And I don't think it's a hugely more greener approach, but I certainly think it's slightly greener. Do you think that's come across, or do you think we're just kind of all being painted the same picture, really? Abby?
I think we've probably been painted all the same picture. I mean, I haven't read all of the reports, but we have a 2045 target, whereas the UK has 2050. Is that right? Or is it 2035, 2040? Well, but we're 5 years ahead of the rest of the UK. But I don't think that was mentioned much. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon has been out and about and pushing, Scotland's environmental credentials at COP, and I think that has been covered, but only probably through the Scottish media who want a Scottish line on it, and Nicola Sturgeon gives them that. I highly doubt that anywhere else in the UK that's probably been picked up, or that's kind of been reflected. And another thing I just want to say, since this is the last question, is back on the oil and gas stuff as well, because the UK government are different and they're running COP. I am convinced that after this ends, they're going to approve Campbell, and they're just waiting for it to finish. So I just want to say that before we went off, because I'm absolutely convinced eventually.
That seems to be the mood music. Fiona, what's your thoughts on how Scotland and the rest of the UK have been portrayed?
Well, when Patricia Espinosa opened the conference, she quoted Burns, news the day and news the hour. So, I mean, there's many delegates that do understand Scotland is different, but unfortunately we're in the UK state, and therefore whatever happens, we will be portrayed as still part of the UK, and it's poor record really for investment in renewables. So no matter what Scotland does, that's the view that will go out.
Mike, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you might be right about Campbell. It'd be very interesting to see how that goes. But I think it's also worth remembering that although Scotland does have some more progressive environmental policies, it's still the Scottish Government's policy to extract as much oil out of the North Sea as possible. And it was only recently that Sturgeon said in an interview, well, actually, I'm against Campbell. But it comes pretty late in the day and it's not very convincing. I think she and the Scottish Government could take a much, much firmer stance in saying, we oppose this. So I'm not that convinced that there's a huge disjuncture between the UK and the Scottish Government's positions on North Sea oil, for example.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Well, I'll just see if we've got any final questions. No, I think that's us done from the audience. So thanks very much for joining us. I know we've got a little bit of COP left. I hope the COP fatigue doesn't set in. I know Saturday's a really big day with the demonstration. But for all of our audience and everyone on Independence Live, Abbi, Fiona, Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.